This is how you become a self-taught sewist. You don't have to go to school to learn how to sew. You don't have to get some certification or a degree in fashion designing to be a sewist. You can learn how to sew from home. So you're new to sewing, but you don't know how to kickstart your sewing journey. Well, the good news is you've already started, because the moment that you got invested in sewing enough to be watching a video like this is the moment that your sewing journey began, even if you've never laid hands on a sewing machine before. In this video, I'm going to be sharing 10 practical steps that you can take in order to start your sewing journey and become the sewist that you've always wanted to be. So number one, decide on what you want to sew. Essentially, you want to find your sewing style. There are many different things that you can sew. You can sew clothes from scratch using fabrics. You can revamp old clothing, go to the thrift store, buy something, turn it into something else. You can make home decor, things for dolls. You can make things for teddy bears. You can make teddy bears. You can make bags. Maybe you want to make cushions, curtains, bed sheets. There's so many different things that you can make. And once you find what your sewing style will be, you can really have more clarity as to how to go forward with your sewing journey. You don't have to focus on all of them. You can pick one, and you're also not limited to one. But the thing about picking one is the fact that it will give you more focus and allow you to master that and then move on to something else. With me, for example, I dived into the world of making clothes from scratch and bags from scratch. But what happened over the years for me is that I ended up focusing more on bags. So I became a pro at making bags. But then, even though I was still making clothes, the skill set I have for making bags is not the same as the skill set I have for making clothes. So I naturally chose to specialize more in bags, and then clothing later on I started to go more into that. But if I gave the same kind of dedication to sewing clothes as I gave to bags, trust me, I would be on a different level than I am right now. So my recommendation for you is that if you can find one sewing style that you really like, that you're passionate about, work on that sewing style, then you can graduate to something else. The second thing that you want to do is to start doing your research and reading. You might not be a reader, so maybe you watch tutorials instead, but I feel like the best way to do it is to get books. Books that are going to educate you on what it is that you're doing, because when you read about a thing before you actually do it, you're that much more likely to do it well. So you're essentially teaching yourself the theory of sewing before you get into the practical part of sewing, which is using a sewing machine or sewing with your hands. The sewing book that I recommend is literally called The Sewing Book, and I have that linked in my description box down below. This is a great book for beginners, and what I love about this book is the fact that it has a lot of pictures in it. This also includes pictures of tools and materials that you actually need in order to start your sewing journey. So I recommend that you take that list or take that book, write down a list of all the tools that you see in there, and then the next steps, that's where it's going to come in handy. This book will also teach you about the fundamentals of sewing, things that you need to know as a beginner, and it shows you step by step how to achieve those things. But I don't feel like the book is good enough on its own. So that's why you should stick around to the end of this video for more details. The third thing that you want to do to start your sewing journey is to get yourself that sewing machine. Once you get the sewing machine, that's when the sewing journey really becomes real. And there are lots of sewing machines that you can buy. There are industrial ones and there are domestic ones. But as a beginner, I recommend that you get a domestic sewing machine. That is perfect for people who are sewing things at home, just not on an industrial level. I can particularly recommend the Singer heavy duty sewing machine. It honestly doesn't matter which model number you get, and the reason why I recommend this is because I personally have this sewing machine. I have experience with it, and I can tell that if I had that sewing machine starting my sewing journey rather than the one I had, which was actually a brother sewing machine, I would have found so much more ease, because the thing about Singer heavy duty sewing machine is the fact that it can handle beginner sewing projects, but because it's heavy duty, when you graduate from the beginner level, you'll still be able to use it to sew intermediate or even advanced sewing projects. I have a video on my YouTube channel about the Singer 4423 sewing machine. And if you want to get familiar with it before you even buy it, you can watch that video. That video will help you in your buying decision. You can also get the 4452, you can get the 4441 or 4411, and they all have different prices. You can get it on Amazon. But if you want to save some money, you can go on singer.com and use my code SOQUAINT10 to get 10% off. Other great places where you can get discounted sewing machines are, for example, eBay, OfferUp, Facebook Marketplace. Those are your best friends. You won't get a brand new sewing machine, but you'll get a sewing machine that you can get started with. And once you familiarize yourself and maybe you have some more money, you can upgrade to something more new. Along with getting a sewing machine, you also want to get sewing tools and materials. And this is going to be extremely important, because if you don't have those sewing tools and materials, there isn't really much that you can do. And you'll notice that very quickly once you actually watch a sewing tutorial. So like I said, the book I recommended earlier will be your guide as to what sewing tools to get. You're gonna need things like scissors, a tape measure, pins, things to draw on your fabric. You're gonna need rulers. All of those things will help you to be prepared for when you actually start sewing. The fourth thing that you want to do to start your sewing journey is to familiarize yourself with your sewing machine. To do this, you first of all want to take it out of the box. You want to practice things like threading the needle, practice filling the bobbin, and practice some stitches on some scrap fabrics. You don't have to make anything at this point. You don't have to be a pro. You don't have to worry about perfection. You don't have to worry about whether you mess up or not. The most important thing is to just get started and to actually sew. When I got my first sewing machine, I took it out of the box the same night. I know a lot of people buy sewing machines or get sewing machines as gifts, and they just have them sitting in a closet. And what's the point of having a sewing machine but not using it? If that's you right now, I'm encouraging you to take that sewing machine out of the box. Okay, but anyway, fast forward back to my story of when I got my first sewing machine. So I took it out of the box on the same day and I started using it immediately. At that point in time, they were actually sending CD manuals with sewing machines. So I watched that, and that helped me to be able to get to know how to use my sewing machine. So it showed me how to thread the needle, how to fill the bobbin, how to do my first stitches, how to do zigzag stitches, how to do straight stitches. And I practiced all of those on a handkerchief that I had, because I didn't have any fabric. So I just used like a handkerchief, like one of these handkerchiefs, and I just stitched on it. And I didn't even worry about if the lines were straight or not. I was just excited about the fact that I was sewing. And when you see that you're sewing and you realize that it's actually not as hard as you think it is, you're going to feel so excited and feel more encouraged about the journey. Sewing can seem really intimidating because perhaps you've seen a lot of complicated things out there and you think you have to make those kind of things, but you don't. You could be such a simple kind of sewist and you'd still be a sewist. You don't have to sew gowns. You don't have to sew jackets. You can sew some really simple things. And that's where my channel comes in handy. My channel has a lot of beginner-friendly sewing tutorials, and I make it my duty to explain everything as well as possible because I want you guys to feel like it's easy for you to do, because it is easy for you to do. All you have to do is just be patient with yourself and have fun. And most importantly, don't get intimidated. The moment that you get intimidated and tell yourself that it's hard is the moment that it's going to be hard. Whatever you think is whatever is going to be real for you. On my channel, I have a video where I'm unboxing a sewing machine and I'm showing you everything from how to thread it, how to fill the bobbin, how to stitch, how to turn it on, all the tools that come with it. And that is probably the most detailed sewing machine video I've ever done, and I recommend that for every beginner sewist, especially if you're getting yourself a Singer sewing machine. So that will be a great guide to help you to get to know your sewing machine even better. But the sewing book will also help you. So you have so many resources that are all going to come together and make it possible for you to have as much clarity as you need. The fifth thing that I would recommend to kickstart your sewing journey is to practice sewing lines and circles. This is going to help you to sew straight. When you start to sew, you're going to find that it's kind of hard to control the fabric. Because it's such new territory, you're going to feel kind of intimidated by the way that the feed dog is moving the fabric, and that in and of itself is going to cause you to not stitch as straight as you could stitch. So my recommendation is, if you could get a book just like this that has pages with lines, take one of those pages out of your book and stitch on those lines. Stitch until you've covered all of the lines and do that over and over again. That is some excellent practice, and it's a really affordable way to get good sewing practice. Like I said, this will help you to sew straight, but if you also want to master the art of sewing in circles or around curves, you can also get like a plate, put it on a piece of paper, trace around that plate, and then stitch on the line. My biggest tip for if you want to really get good at sewing is to sew slowly. When you're a beginner, don't feel pressured to stitch fast. Don't feel pressured that you have to go quickly. You can press on the presser foot very gently and therefore sew slowly, and that is going to give you more confidence to eventually pick up speed. It's just like when you're learning a dance. You want to learn the dance slowly before you actually go at the pace that you're supposed to be going. This is how you become a self-taught sewist. You don't have to go to school to learn how to sew. You don't have to get some certification or a degree in fashion designing to be a sewist. You can learn how to sew from home. The sixth thing that you can do to kickstart your sewing journey is to practice some sewing tutorials. Find sewing tutorials that you really want to work on or things that you think you like, and actually get started on them. First of all, you want to watch the tutorial and check to see what materials you're going to be needing. Watch the entire thing through to see what's going to be required of you. What are the steps? And I want you to wrap your head around doing it and look at it and just be like, oh, I can do that. That's actually very easy. Sometimes you watch a tutorial and you realize that it's actually not something that's so hard to do. If you've never done anything hard in your life before, which I really hope that you have, then it might feel like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. But if you have done hard things, then best believe you can sew as well. And I don't want to make it sound like sewing is a hard thing to do either. Sewing is a very easy thing to do. All you have to do is just tell yourself, I can do it. This is easy, and even if it's not easy, it's gonna become easy to me. You are already on your way to being a master sewist. I encourage you to make lots of mistakes. You're going to sew things that don't look good at all. If you were to see some of the things that I stitched when I first started sewing, you would choke, okay? I'm choking right now just thinking about it. I mean, I'm not literally choking, obviously, but when I look back at the things that I used to make when I just started my sewing journey, they are nothing in comparison to what I make now. I never had a guide like myself to teach me the things that I'm now teaching you. You can get further than I got in the amount of time that I took to get here. I've been sewing for a decade. I got my first sewing machine in 2014. So I've been sewing for a decade. It didn't take me a decade to master certain things, but the more you do a thing, the better you get. And that's why you want to start those sewing tutorials. Actually make something. So if it's gonna be a cushion, start off with a cushion. I have a lot of beginner sewing tutorials here on my channel. I show you how to make a scrunchie. I show you how to make a head wrap, how to make a scarf, how to make a pencil skirt, how to make a high-waisted shorts, elastic waistband shorts, key fobs, simple things like those you can start with, and That will build your way up to feeling confident enough to make something else. Now, let's be honest, you're probably going to make some things that you don't even feel confident wearing on the road because maybe they don't look straight enough. Maybe you don't have an overlock or a serger machine to finish your edges. Maybe your hems look horrible, but that's okay. You don't have to wear them on the road. I'd like to think you already have clothes, so you can just keep on wearing the clothes that you currently have, and the things that you make, you can wear those at home. And then when you feel confident enough and you start making better things, you can wear those on the road. I am currently at a stage where I make 99% of my wardrobe, and it's such a great feeling. I know that's a goal for a lot of people and it's not hard to achieve. It just happens one clothing item at a time. And you have to be patient with yourself. And over the years and months, you will accumulate enough clothes to be able to possibly give away the clothes that you've bought. Right there, you'll be contributing to sustainable living, to slow living, and no longer contributing to fast fashion. Because fast fashion is an industry that really does a number on the earth. And I don't try too hard to preach stop wearing fast fashion, because that will never happen. People will always be wearing fast fashion because the truth is a lot of people can't sew and a lot of people can't afford higher quality clothing. So they have to just stick to the Shein purchases and the Forever 21 purchases and the purchases from the stores that pretty much use child labor. I play my part in boycotting fast fashion by making my own clothes. Starting this sewing journey is you also contributing to the boycotting of fast fashion. And that's something to celebrate. The seventh thing that you can do in order to kickstart your sewing journey is to take a sewing class or a sewing course. Now, this step is completely optional. You don't have to do this at all, but if you feel like you want guidance from someone who is more experienced than you, then a sewing class or a sewing course is an amazing idea. I don't have any sewing courses just yet. I'm working on that, but I do have sewing classes here in Jamaica on Saturdays. So if that's something you want to sign up for, then the link for that will be in my description box as well. If you click on it and you notice that there are no dates available, then it possibly means that you're watching this far in the future and I am probably not offering the classes anymore, or I am currently taking a break because I am due to have a baby in a couple of months. There may even be sewing classes in your local area. You can check those out. You can check for sewing courses on the internet. There are lots of sewing gurus and sewing vloggers, I guess you could say, who offer courses. So if you watch their tutorials and you hear them mentioning a sewing course and you want to take that sewing course, then you can definitely go ahead and do something like that. But working with more experienced people will open your eyes to a lot of things that you never learned from books or tutorials, because there are a lot of things that will not be mentioned in tutorials, even just like nonverbals or like tips and tricks or just things that shift your perspective on how you look at sewing in and of itself. Take some classes if you really want to invest in yourself, and you're still going to be considered self-taught because you started the journey on your own. Step 8 is to keep on practicing and to keep on learning. I include this as a step in and of itself because even after you have started using your sewing machine, you might relapse and you might stop sewing. You might just have your sewing machine picking up dust for months after sewing 2 sewing projects. And right there and then, you're losing time on the practicing that you could be doing. And the more you practice is the better you get. Okay? So you have to be practicing. The more you do a thing, the better you get at it. The first time you drove a car, if you've ever driven, you were not great at it. I don't think anybody starts driving being a pro driver. Like, nobody does that. Everybody starts to drive as a beginner. But the more they drive is the better they become at driving. When you just start cooking, you don't start cooking as a pro, but the more you cook, the better you become at it. So the more you sew, the better you're going to become at it. So create a sewing schedule or a sewing routine for yourself. If you have a full-time job and maybe you have kids, then something that would be sustainable is maybe you'll sew once a week. or twice a week. If you have lots of time on your hands, you can sew every day of the week, like in the afternoon when you get home from work or school, or if you have all the time in the world, you just sew every single day. I got so good at sewing because I could sew every day. I didn't complete my university degree, but I came out of 2 years of university and straight into sewing. So I started the practical like immediately. I was actually sewing before I stopped my degree that I was doing. And when I took my summer break after my last semester, I pretty much just went so deep into sewing that I was doing it every day. And the more I did it, the better I got at it. The less time you spend sewing is the longer it's going to take for you to become a pro. So I want to say also, give yourself grace. Don't expect yourself to become perfect overnight. If you're just sewing once a week, don't expect yourself to become a pro at sewing in a month, because that's just 4 sewing sessions. And every time you get a chance to sew, I would recommend sewing. Even if you're not sewing, watch a sewing tutorial. And when you're watching sewing tutorials, take notes. I am a note taker. That's why I have this notebook right here. All of the things I am telling you right now, I wrote them down before I actually came on camera to talk to you about them. And if you write things down, you'll have access to it, because sometimes you lose the tutorial. You won't be able to find it back. Or maybe you're the type of person who, when you write things down, you're able to remember them and integrate them better that way. So I recommend that you take notes, even if it's just on your iPhone or your iPad or your Android phone. Just take notes of each of the steps, and you can write things down in there that will also make you grasp it better. So maybe you can write a step down, but maybe you understand it a different way than how they explain it, and you can write that as a subsequent note under the notes that you are taking. The 9th thing that you can do to kickstart your sewing journey is to create a sewing community. Now, I don't mean a literal sewing community, even though if you can make a literal sewing community, that's great as well. You can gather together a bunch of your friends who want to start sewing and sew together, or just talk about sewing together, or maybe you can just have like a WhatsApp group where you're talking about the things that you're learning how to sew right now. Maybe you're sharing your tips, maybe you're sharing tutorials that you like and find helpful with each other. And follow sewists online, whether it's on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Follow people who also sew their own clothes or sew whatever it is that you want to learn how to sew. And they will be a constant reminder. They will be a reminder of the fact that you told yourself you want to be on a sewing journey. They will be a reminder to go pick up your sewing machine. Every time you see them post something that they made, it's going to inspire you to want to go make something too. Not to mention, they will share tips and hacks and tricks with you that will make you get better at your sewing journey and make you just feel like, oh my gosh, I need to go sew right now. You know what I'm saying? So follow a lot of sewists on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube. I am one of those great ones to follow. Well, I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but every time I post another sewing tutorial, people comment saying, you've inspired me to go pick up my sewing machine. You could even go as far as joining Patreon groups that offer like exclusive sewing content. The 10th and final thing that I want to share to start your sewing journey is to practice pattern drafting. And I am mentioning this last because there are some things that don't necessarily require a sewing pattern. For example, you can just take one of your existing clothing, fold it in half, trace it out, and make clothes from that. You don't have to make a sewing pattern from scratch. So that's the reason why I'm mentioning this as the 10th and final step. Practice pattern drafting. Pattern drafting is literally where everything starts in sewing. A lot of things are easier to sew when you have a pattern for it. Even if it's just a cushion, you could have a square that you cut out and make a cushion. And if you have that pattern made, you will never have to worry about drawing a square on your fabric ever again, because maybe that's something that you would do if you're making a new item of clothing. And there are a lot of people who like to draw their clothes or draw the pattern on their clothes before they actually start to cut it and sew it. But that's unsustainable in my opinion, because you have to draft a new pattern every single time. Like, that's a lot of time to be using when you could just have a pattern already made, put that on your fabric every single time and just cut it. Especially if it's something you know that you want to make often, simply because maybe you just love it that much, or maybe you start selling it and it's doing really well and you have to make hundreds of it. So get into pattern drafting. I have lots of pattern drafting tutorials here on my channel that are very beginner friendly. And like I emphasize, I always try to make my tutorials easy to grasp. I always aim to make my tutorials like simple. I try to explain them in a way where if you've never ever heard of the concept of sewing, you can still understand what it is that I'm saying. Pattern drafting has its own set of tools that you will need. And even if you don't want to draft your own patterns, you can just buy patterns from websites and from Etsy shops. I sell patterns as well on QUAINT.com, and I do have an Etsy shop where I sell patterns, so you can check those patterns out as well. I have a pattern for an elastic waistband shorts, for joggers, for A-line skirts, pencil skirts, really simple things that you can just put together, cut, and sew whatever you want to sew. I will say though that one of the complicated things about using a pattern that you purchase online is that you have to put it together. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together, but I feel like it's worth it if you really want to be able to make this item. You can either spend your money and some of your energy, or just your energy and a lot of brain work to draft a pattern for yourself, in comparison to what I mentioned before would pretty much be you just like buying a pattern on the internet. But I really hope that these tips were helpful. If they were helpful, be sure to check out my sewing playlist here and my pattern drafting playlist here.